Hello everybody, I can't actually see anybody. Hello everybody. So I'm Jed Ashforthe, I'm from PlayStation VR. I actually work as the Immersive Experience Specialist in the Immersive Technology Group. We're based up near Liverpool, where all the great things happen in VR. So, this isn't just to talk about PlayStation VR today, it's to talk about the wider VR landscape, to be honest with you, about where we all stand now and kind of where we might be looking next. So let me just give you a quick update on the PlayStation VR situation, get it out of the way. 2016, year of consumer VR, 92 days until PlayStation VR launches, 2,208 hours, which sounds really, really scary. And that's a little bit terrifying when I think about that. Price points, you'll know, they've been announced. We've got 50 titles between launch day and the end of the year, which is pretty good. And we've got more than 200 developers, that's development studios, not just developers, working on content at the moment. So I think, you know, it's pretty exciting times. We're in a very good place. Consumer VR in general is in a very good place. The last 6 months have been really exciting for anybody who's in VR. So many cool new games, so many inspirational experiences that I've got to try, so many amazing things I've got to do for the very first time. And there's so many developers working in VR right now, and a lot of them achieving just some amazing work. When you think about how far we've come, how quickly, and what people are doing, and kind of how quickly the bar's been moved on, it's fantastic. You developers have ventured into an entirely unexplored new medium, and you've kind of climbed really, really high, really, really quickly. And the developers I know, they're coming out of the first games now, a lot of them, looking quite weary and, you know, exhausted, but with a big grin on their faces because of what they've achieved, and quite rightly so. But the question is, what comes next? You spend time and budget and effort exploring. Do you continue to harvest those same fruits that you found last time, or do you keep on pioneering and see what's over the next hill? So in short, your players are having a really good kind of time today with what you've done and everything. Players who are going to be getting to play PlayStation VR very, very soon are going to be really enjoying it. But the question is, where are you going to take them next? What are you going to show them next? How are you going to top what you've done? What's the new magic that you're going to bring to them? So I'm quite fortunate in my role that I get to cast a very wide eye over all the VR systems, all the solutions that are out there, all the games and experiences that are coming out. I kind of get to see lots more stuff than most of you probably do, which makes me super lucky, and I'm really appreciative of it. It does mean I get to see a very wide breadth of what's out there, and part of my job is to kind of think about the future, and try and spot patterns and trends and kind of interesting, fertile areas that we can flag up to developers and kind of share with developers, which is what I'm doing today with you guys. So this is aimed at anybody working in VR, interested in VR, but especially relevant for anybody who's kind of looking at starting a second or third title and thinking, where do we go next? Because sometimes when you got your head in the trenches working hard on something for release, you don't get time to kind of look up and see the rest of the landscape that's out there. Now, to achieve mainstream success in anything, it's very true that a tangible physical user experience needs to be the very first consideration. And this is certainly going to be true of VR as well. Everything in this talk today is in pursuance of finding ways to help you offer the very best user experience to your players. And this is where we all need to focus, looking at the kind of wide horizon of opportunity that's out there in front of us now. There are multiple ways that we can elevate that user experience that we've already kind of achieved, and we can make it better than what we're offering at the moment. And I'm signing into the Hilton. Okay. I'm secretly hacking the system while I'm doing the presentation, you see. So this is something that I think is very true. It needs to be effortless and delightful for every user, and that's how we're going to kind of get that elevated user experience that's going to really get us to mainstream success. If you think about the iPhone, if you think about 9 years ago, it was the first smartphone that offered a really good user experience, okay? It was head and shoulders above anything else you'd used. And it was a kind of magical thing the first time you used a first generation iPhone or an iPod Touch. It was kind of a step beyond what you'd seen before, and that was exciting. It was very seductive. Just bear with me a second, thank you. And the thing is, that was what made the difference, right? That was what made it a success, because the functionality Apple were offering was available on other devices at the time. It wasn't the cheapest, not by a long chalk, but the user experience was absolutely wonderful. So I think if you can get a user experience that's very intuitive and joyful, just like Apple did, really enjoyable to use, then users are going to flock to it. They're going to try it and they're going to stick with it and they're going to show it to other people. And it's a really, really good way to kind of grow your market. So what I'm going to kind of do today is give you some starting points, some seeds, some ideas, and you can go away and think about and kind of think maybe we could explore down that avenue, or maybe we could think down that avenue. So starting first of all, what I want to talk about is kind of what the user experience is when users first come into it. It is kind of crazy voodoo magic to users. They don't see it as this is really clever technology like we do. They don't deconstruct it. They just have this incredible experience unlike anything they've ever had before. Now, I love to speak with new users because you get to see that glimpse of magic in their eyes from what they've just encountered. And if you make VR, it can be hard to kind of see past that trick sometimes. Pardon me. You kind of know how the magician's doing it. You work in the sausage factory, you know. But for users, it's a very powerful medium. And it remains so even after extended use. I've done thousands and thousands of hours of VR, and it's still incredible to me. I still find it full of wonder every time I do something new in there. So you've got to remember that a user's first point of contact is magical and awe-inspiring. Someone suggested to me recently that the VR is the closest thing that most people will come to experiencing true magic in their lifetime. And I think that's a really nice way to kind of think about it. And over the coming years, so many people in the world are going to experience it for the first time. Think about how many people we know and we kind of think VR's arrived and it's out there and people are using it and it's popular. But the number of people who've tried VR in the world is a tiny fraction of all the people who are out there, all the people who could experience it over the next few years. So that's how you've got to kind of think about it. It's a golden opportunity to make someone not only fall in love with the medium, but to fall in love with your creation, fall in love with your studio maybe, and follow you till the end of time, because that first experience had such an impact on them that, you know, it kind of really made them want to kind of find out more of what you're doing. It's that kind of level of VR magic that I'm talking about. So make your opening moments, make every moment in your game, in your experience, as magical as you can be. Just think about that user experience all the time. Don't put up with clunkiness. Don't put up with things that aren't right or things that could be better and we'll come back and do it. Just make sure from beginning to end it's kind of the smoothest, nicest thing you can do. And we do see this in a lot of our PlayStation VR launch titles. A lot of them are very, very polished, and it's just a joyful experience to use, and it's absolutely fantastic. I like to tell developers, if your players telling everybody in the room, you've got to see this is amazing, before they've even got past the front menu, then get your coat, guys, because you've pulled, right? That user's with you for the rest of the night now. They're going to absolutely love what you're doing. Another thing to think about, this is a real nice way of thinking about it, no tech out there has more potential to break creative ground. There's nothing out there that's kind of more fertile at the moment with possibilities and unknowns than virtual reality is. And players see that potential. Part of that look of wonder on a new user's face is, what did I just experience? But another part of it you can see is definitely that potential. What could I experience with this thing? This is amazing. This is a new thing in my life. Whoa, where could this take me? What could this do? Straight away, players are getting excited about the creative possibilities that this magical new thing might enable for them. So when we talk about VR, we say it's the most personal, user-focused experience ever. It happens to the user, it happens around the user, and it happens for the user. And this is the key, it's the thing to remember. VR's already making a significant impact on the world, like I said, but for it to achieve mass market success, that's mass market in terms of smartphones and HDTVs and Coca-Cola, that's not going to happen until it's mature, and it is the user experience that has to be mature. That's what's going to guarantee success. So the whole point of VR games is to give users an amazing experience that they can't get anywhere else. So it follows that getting that user experience as refined as you possibly can, as a standard, as a baseline, as all these new users are coming to it, let's get it to that level where it's absolutely incredible from the start for everybody. And then we can be well on our way to that. Another thing that's really attractive about it is it's the most natural gaming interface out there. It's a big part of the magic of VR, from my point of view, is how natural and intuitive it can be. People look around it like they do in the real world. You give people hands, it's empowering and it's familiar and it's natural, and everyone can work VR hands pretty much straight away. Everybody gets it. You don't need to give them instructions. And early VR games are kind of showing us that this medium naturally actually does have a potential much wider audience than anything else we've ever done with video games, probably any other medium out there, because it's so easy to interact with, because it can be so natural. And we've seen really good examples of how that can be. So early VR games can probably count on many more players trying out your games than you might be originally expected, that we might be originally have feared 2 years ago when some of us started on this journey. You know, mums, grands, uncles, aunts, kids, wives, mistresses, mates, and probably complete strangers that people are going to pull in from the pub and stuff like that. You've got to come and try this thing. So ask yourself that question: is your content inclusive of that wider potential audience? Are you making something that really can have that super wide mass market appeal? So here's your seed idea from this. Players are coming for the magic. Excuse me. Come back. Players are coming for the magic. So that should be a primary focus in what you're doing. Don't make Muggle VR. Don't make VR that just kind of works. Bring the magic to it. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, presence, and this idea of presence wrangling, which is something some of you may have heard me talk about before. It's one of my favourite subjects to talk about. It's kind of what I do for a job. Presence, unique selling point of VR, obviously, and we've learned a lot about it already. It's a really fascinating area to explore. It's the next area for growth that I want us to kind of just talk about quickly. I can see that a really breakout VR title might be one that the mass market responds to because it's mastered this art of presence a little bit more. It really gets how to kind of evoke a presence state, and it's a game that knows how to maintain a player in that present state and maybe does some interesting and fun things with having the player in that present state. I think learning to keep the player successfully immersed is absolutely core. It's essential as VR gets more popular because this is what people are coming to the medium for. This is what they want to experience. And there are ways that we can influence and maintain that present state. So first of all, there's the body, okay? Seeing, hearing, your posture, the physical senses and what they're sending to the brain. All that stuff that we usually talk about, that's kind of body stuff at the moment, and that's kind of the area that most people have been thinking in and the challenges that most people have been facing. But there are other ways in. The mind is a really good way. This is where the immersion happens, remember. All the body elements are just sending signals to the mind. So if you can affect the mind, and this sounds creepy, but if you can affect the mind in a positive way, then maybe that's something that you can actually use to affect the present state. So you've got to remember, we engage with ideas and concepts behind narratives in games at different levels, and it really depends how immersed you are in the story. I find in VR, I kind of think about things that are happening in the story, think about things that are happening in the game a lot more and to a deeper level than I do when I'm playing on the screen. When I'm playing on the screen, to me, as somebody who's played a long time, it's kind of a process. While I get immersed in it, I don't really think about the ideas all that much. While I'm playing, I'm engaged in the action, and then you get your cutscenes where you go, oh, that's an interesting thing to think about. In VR, it's all happening at once, and that actually drives and enhances that sense of presence. Okay, it acts like a kind of feedback loop. You give the player something interesting to think about in the game, a puzzle to solve, a challenge, narrative elements, dialogue, you know, all these things, whether it's kind of extrovertly, explicitly put in front of them or whether it's subtext. If your player starts thinking about it, it's a really good way to enhance and maintain presence in this kind of feedback loop of they're thinking in the game, they're in the world, thinking about the world. And that's a really good kind of place to get the player. That act of thinking in the world is a really, really good way to control presence, and it's a really easy way to control presence if you've got a good writer and a good designer. The next one is expectation. As long as the player's expectations are met, then you can maintain that present state. Every mismatch that you come up against in a VR experience is simply an expectation that the player has that's not being met, okay? Those are the things that pull you out of VR and remind you that it isn't real. So that's something that you can actually manage through careful design. You can see the expectations through the experience, and you can set those expectations up for the user. And you can really establish the rules of your world so that the player's expecting what they get and they kind of get what they're expecting. And that really helps you maintain that level of presence. Internal consistency, lots of people say this about VR, but it's absolutely true. Internal consistency is the key to a believable world, not realism. As long as you follow the rules and stick to them inside your world, people will be happy to exist in there and adhere to those worlds and be complicit with them, complicit with the rules, sorry. The other thing is distraction. So this is something that we're very interested in how this functions, because we've noticed this is actually very, very effective. The concept's very simple. It's kind of a variation on the idea of engaging the player's mind, but you're actually engaging the motor functions. You're engaging the kind of active part of the brain that's playing the game. If you keep the player so entertained and so involved that they don't want to stop and smell the roses, then they're not going to notice that they've got no scent, right? A good example of this is the London Heist, okay? In the London Heist, you have this great shootout where you're in a van going down this motorway. You're so busy shooting all the guys off the motorbikes and shooting out the petrol caps and the tyres on the cars and stuff like that, and seeing them cartwheeling through the air and big explosions. It's fantastic. You don't notice the fact that the guy who's driving is actually steering about all over the road, and normally that would be one of those things we would really recommend against doing in VR. But it works because at no point does the action ever let up long enough for the player to sort of go, oh, this is a bit weird, this is a bit weird. They're completely kind of entranced with it, and that really kind of carries it through. Okay, so this is the thing to remember. Deep immersion is fragile. So there's a skill requirement here. The kind of work that I do with developers a lot is something that teams, I think, are going to really benefit from having people on the team who are really good at this sort of stuff. Keeping the player really immersed in that world and successfully managing and distracting from any mismatches that come along, spotting them in the game design, spotting them in the experience as you're testing it, and finding ways to kind of smooth them out and iron them out is a really useful skill to have on your team. And a team that kind of specialise in that area is a team that I think can do very, very well in the future. It's going to be something that really set those teams apart, that they've really nailed the kind of user experience. I think in future we'll all be measuring VR games and experiences in this way. We'll be thinking about how immersive it is, because players are going to flock to these things if they flock there because they want that escapism. That's what they're coming for. They're coming for that believability, that immersion. So that should definitely be a focus. And that idea of kind of having somebody whose job it is to maintain that present state and make sure that as much as you can your game's doing all the right things, really good thing to have on your team. Now, we talk about presence. It's kind of powerful in sort of 4 discrete forms that I've experienced so far. There'll be more to come, I'm sure. Presence we all know about. We don't have to talk about that. Shared presence is a sense of sharing a virtual space with another avatar or avatars, feeling like you're sharing a physical space with another human being, okay? It's very cool. Lots of people have said it this week, and if you've never tried it, you've got to try it. It's really, really cool. It's very eye-opening the first time you do it. Telepresence is how we describe the sense of being in the world, but not as a living entity. So even if you've kind of got a non-standard form, you've got non-standard interactions, you've got a non-standard way of locomoting around the world, it's still you in VR. So an example of this, for instance, might be if you were controlling a security camera with your head. Okay, that sort of thing. Or another good example is a third-person camera, where you're not acknowledged as being part of the fiction, you're just a camera following it around. So that's what... Telepresence has a wider meaning than that, of course, but you know that's the term that we use to describe that particular type of presence. And then AI presence is the belief that an AI agent in the game encountered in VR is actually real. And now that sounds very science fiction, I know, and oh yeah, one day. And there's plenty of Hollywood movies about this sort of stuff. But if you think about it, this happens in VR all the time. You know, you take your legs away from the shark in the shark case so it doesn't snap your legs off. A zombie comes too close and you start lashing out with your controllers to fight it away. That can't happen if you're not believing, even for a moment, a fleeting moment, that that's real. So there's glimmers of this stuff. And we see it in things like, if any of you ever get to try Summer Lesson, if we ever demo that on the run-up to launch, have a go on it, because that's very, very powerful in terms of interacting with another character. And for moments, you fool yourself into believing it's a real person. So I think that's a really fertile area to be looking into. I think there's a lot that can be done there, and as science fiction as it sounds, I think we're closer than you might be expecting. This is a very true thing, and this is something to bear in mind of the value of VR. It's unique. It can offer something that no other medium can offer. It can let a user be in another place, feel like they're physically in another place. Nothing else can offer that. In terms of communication potential, that's huge. I've got a fly buzzing around me, go away. That's up the numbers by 1 though. Oh, get out my hair, honestly. Right, he's shooting me off the stage, I think. when you think about it, that's really kind of important, because all the communication methods out there, and these days we have so many, none of them can do this. None of them can kind of even get close to this. This is like Skype times 1,000, right? When it's done right, and that sense of being there with another person, it's extremely powerful. So again, this is another area to really kind of focus on and look at. So the seed from this, the thing to take away and think about is, what can we do with this? It's a unique, powerful ability. What can we actually do with it? Next one I'm going to talk to you about is the avatar relationship, which is quite unique in VR. In VR, your relationship with your avatar is a very rich space, for someone to go away and explore. And I know some teams are already starting to look at this, and I find this area very fascinating to follow. It's an entirely new thing that we're doing, that we haven't really been able to do before. You're actually, virtually, able to put somebody in somebody else's shoes. And that's such a common saying, oh, you know, if you could walk a mile in my shoes, oh, you know, if I look that good in jeans. Now we can do that. Now we can actually put somebody in somebody else's form. For the first time, we're starting to be able to do that. Obviously, there's a lot of problems to iron out before we can say, wow, you know, my bum now looks fantastic in these jeans. But we're getting there. We're on the way to it. So it's an exciting area to explore. Now, Chris Milk made this famous quote, VR is an empathy machine. I've always kind of thought this and always kind of said this, but quite lately I've also ruminated on the fact that when you think about it, interactivity is actually the opposite of empathy. As soon as you start doing anything in VR, as soon as you start interacting with the world, you can watch a 360 video about refugees and you're completely concentrating on the plight of the refugee. You're not part of that. You're just a telepresence in that, okay? As soon as you give the player, the user, the opportunity to interact with the world, give them agency over what's happening, suddenly it becomes about them. What can I do in this world? How can I affect things? Everything they do is going to interact with the world, and they'll be thinking about that. So in a way, it draws away from that empathy. So while empathy can be done in VR, you have to be careful. I do think the more interactivity you give, the more it kind of pulls away from it. But what's interesting is that we've got another sign-in for the Hilton. They really want me to sign in. Let me just turn my Wi-Fi off. Sorry, guys. Do you know, we'll chant it. If it comes up again, everybody scream. It'll be a bit pantomime, it'll be fun. So this idea of inhabiting an avatar actually throws the creative scope wide open. It's very interesting when you stop and think about it, the idea of putting you in somebody else's body, okay? I'm looking at this a lot in my work right now. One of the things that we've kind of shown recently at E3 is Batman VR. And in Batman VR, you get to kind of don the cowl, you get to put the belt on, put the gloves on, and see yourself in the mirror, and you're Batman. You're Batman, you're absolutely Batman. And you hear this voice in your head, and it's like, I'm Batman. And you're like, yeah, I'm Batman, I'm absolutely Batman. And it's very powerful because you know who Batman is, and you understand Batman, and you can play that character. Anybody can be Batman because they get Batman. I'm pretty certain, you know, that that's a very powerful thing, but it works especially well for established characters. What happens if you've got a character that you're trying to establish in your game? What happens if you're trying to cast the player in a role that they don't know? And that character has a personality that doesn't necessarily match with your user. So, for instance, if you put the player in an Indiana Jones game, everybody knows Indiana Jones. What's interesting about this is, if the player's not afraid of snakes and Indiana Jones is, that's a design problem you've got to solve. Okay, what are you going to do? Are you just going to kind of make the snakes really deadly, even though they're not? It's a fear thing. Are we going to do some kind of weird psychosis effect to kind of emulate that? Or are we going to give players a kind of way to just make them feel like, actually, I'm like Indy +1. I'm better than Indy. I've got everything Indy's got, but I'm not afraid of snakes, so I'm even better. I don't know what the answer to that is, but again, I think that's a really interesting area to explore. Acknowledgement in the world. When there's that moment in The Matrix and Neo's walking down the street and all of a sudden the AI turns on its ability to see him and everybody turns and looks at him. I've done that in VR and it's really powerful. It's really horrible as well, but it's really powerful. And that fact of being in the world is entirely dependent on you feeling that you're part of that world, okay? That telepresence state isn't nearly as immersive. It doesn't nearly induce the same sense of presence because nobody's acknowledging you there. You're just a ghost. You might be able to interact with the world and things, but if nobody can see you, how can you really be there? The moment somebody makes eye contact with you in VR, the moment someone acknowledges your presence in the world, that's kind of, it is like a super trigger. It really, really kind of makes you feel that present state. So that's something that we see being done a lot in games. There's a lot of times when the character will turn and look at the camera in a third-person game, or characters will make direct eye contact with you in a first-person game. Very, very powerful. So I think that's an interesting area to kind of explore. Excuse me. Because like I say, you need to believe that you're there to really believe that you're there, and you need that acknowledgement from other people. Now, I used to say for this, you bring your own baggage to VR. What I now say is you bring your own bizarre to VR because it rhymes. So that makes it immediately better. And also our PR team said baggage was a bit negative. So bizarre, can't see what's wrong with that. But the thing is, if you're casting a player in a role, that Indiana Jones situation, how are you going to cope with that when they're bringing their own fears in? How do you make a Metal Gear Solid game where Snake's got to spend at least half the playing time hiding in air vents and in long grass if your player gets claustrophobic and they don't want to do that? So that's an interesting challenge. Again, there are ways to design around that, and we've kind of explored a bunch of those, and I've spoken some of those in the past, so if anybody's interested, get in contact with me. Happy to furnish you with more details. I think the breakthrough title in VR could be one that kind of works because it tailors itself to everybody. It is that kind of game that appeals to absolutely everybody because it just works for everybody. We see it with things like Tilt Brush that don't have a lot of these challenges to tackle, and everybody loves it. So it's definitely a valid path to go down and explore. How do we make a game something that will tailor itself to every player and make it just so that there are comfort options, but also it's clever enough to know what to apply when. So I think that's a fertile area to be looking at. And another thing to think about, single-player VR might be the very best case for teamwork. I love this. This is called the Chewbacca theory, so bear with me on this, okay? If you were going to make a Han and Chewbacca game in VR, and if anyone is making a Han and Chewbacca game in VR, I am available and I can come and work on it. I would love to work on that. But if anybody's making that, you would immediately think, well, let's cast the player as Han, right? Because Han's the hero. Everybody wants to be the hero. But if you think about it, Chewie's actually the one that's kind of a better fit for the player in that relationship. Whenever Han's off pouting scruffily and being all princess baity, he's back doing objectives, levelling up his repair the ship skill, right? And he's actually interacting with the world in ways that we could get the player to do. He gets his objectives from Han, fix the hyperdrive, and he gets on with it, right? And it's a task he's being given. Something interesting happens to Han in the meantime. Chewie's always there, helping him out. He's always there for the gunfights, and he gets to do all the fun stuff. But we don't have to get Chewie involved in a romance subplot because he can watch the other romance subplot. He can be involved peripherally, but in a way that's much easier for us to control. So it's an interesting way of kind of looking at it. And even when you kind of think about it at the end of Empire Strikes Back, when Han finally gets frozen in spoilers if you've not seen it, gets frozen in carbonite and taken away, Chewie gets his moment, right? Run down a corridor-based shooter and take everybody out. It's a perfect fit. So it does seem like that kind of buddy approach of don't be Batman, be Robin, might be a really easy way to kind of get the player in a place where there's somebody that can communicate with them in VR, somebody that can tell them ideas, give them objectives, feedback on what they're doing, without you having to make a really, really resilient, wide-ranging set of systems to cater to all this stuff. So you see from this one is what new creative opportunities does this new relationship between the avatar and the player, what does it open up? An awful lot, I think, so I think it's definitely one worth looking at. Next thing to think about is control inputs. Control inputs are very different in VR, like I said before, very, very natural. This idea of controls being so natural that you can play blindfolded is a really good way to think about it, I think. It's a great little motto to work to because the user is effectively blindfolded. And while I know that we have great conventions now where we can see the controller in VR, and you can kind of see what the keys do and what the controls do, and that's absolutely fantastic, and long may it reign as the kind of right way of doing things because it's the right thing to do for the user experience. It elevates it an awful lot and makes it very, very usable. I also kind of worship at another church that sort of says some games should be kind of so interactive and so natural and everything, you don't need those instructions. You should just be able to pick the game up and play with it. And we do see this a lot emerging in VR, and I kind of think that's another great thing to follow as well. We see it with the London heist. So in the London heist, you kind of have these gloves, these hands, and people pick up a gun, and they know how to shoot a gun, and they pick up a clip, and they know how to reload the clip, and they know how to open drawers, they know how to open doors, they even open doors that are on a hinge the right way without being told. Nobody kind of struggles with it. The only thing we ever see people having a problem with this is people who don't actually watch enough Hollywood action movies, and they don't know that you have to slam a clip into the bottom of the gun, and we do get people going like this with the gun and trying to kind of get it to clip in. But very, very natural, very, very intuitive. Now, another thing to think about is that the onus has shifted. What this naturalness of the hand controller shows us is that we can't now hide behind the abstraction of viewing the world through a TV and interacting with the world through a controller. We've taken away those abstraction layers, so now if your controls feel convoluted and clunky, players aren't going to accept it nearly as readily anymore. You've got to get them right, you've got to get them true, you've got to get them feeling just perfect, I think. Flat games, it always felt to me like those combined layers of abstraction of playing through a TV screen at a distance and seeing into the world through a window and using a controller kind of excused an awful lot. You could get away with emulating the feel a lot easier than you can in VR. In VR, you've got to kind of get it feeling a lot more accurately. So it does feel like the onus has shifted to us now. We can't hide behind that anymore, and we've really got to kind of concentrate in that area. Touch points, as we know, touch points are the things where you can feel in real life what it looks like you're touching in VR. So, you know, if you sat on a seat, you sat in a seat in VR, or if you're holding a motion controller and it looks like a sword and it feels like a sword, that's touch points. Can add a lot of power to presence. When they're right, what I've found over time is when they're right, they can add an awful lot. But I was initially quite concerned about this sort of stuff and thought, when they're wrong, that's going to be really hard and we're going to spend loads of time trying to overcome these difficulties and solve these problems. And what I've actually found is, no, when they're wrong, it's just a minor point away. Players get used to them quite easily and put up with them quite easily. So it's kind of big win if you get it right, very small loss if you get it wrong. So it's not one to worry about too much, but use them where you can to elevate that user experience as much as you can. Another thing to think about, we're tracking the head. But users always engage with VR with their entire body when they play. One of my problems that keeps me from the best scores in Res Infinite that I've got, in Res Infinite on the PlayStation VR, which is absolutely fantastic, and Res is one of my favourite games and I love it, but I have a problem with VR that makes my scores rubbish compared to when I play it in 2D, and that's because I'm dancing the entire time I'm playing it. I can't stop moving and it affects my aim because you aim with your head. So that's a weird little problem for that team to solve. They're just going to have to get people to actually sit down like we always tell them to, but it's infectious. I can't stop myself doing it, unfortunately. Standing VR is a whole body experience though. And so even though we're only tracking the head and hands, we're already starting to see really, really interesting things where you can actually kind of emulate a lot of the whole body stuff. But it's that thought of what is the player actually doing when they're playing the game. So in Triangular Pixels, Unseen Diplomacy, these guys are here today, you have to fit through these laser grids and things like this, and you will bend and contort your body to fit through these narrow things like you've seen on movies, and you forget that it's only your head and hands that are having to be tracked. In fact, as soon as you do kind of pull out of that present state and you get that cognitive realization that I don't have to do this, it kind of spoils the trick a little bit. So I'm always kind of keen whenever we show this game to anybody in the studio, not to tell them that at all, and just seeing everybody does it. I've noticed every single person always tries to kind of fit through the beams and stuff like that, which is fascinating. It's an example of that kind of crazy voodoo magic that I was talking about. For players, they don't see the tech, they don't see the limitations of it, they just see the possibilities, and that's what they're engaging with. So it's worth remembering and thinking on, both from an interaction point of view and also from a safety point of view. You know, if you think about what the player might be doing with their entire body while you're only focusing on keeping the head safe, that's definitely something to think about as well. So, hands up in the room who's giving a VR demo to somebody else, right? Anybody? Excellent, okay. Keep your hands up if while you're doing that you shook the chair to make it feel like an earthquake, or you put zombie hands on them when the zombie got on them. Right, you people are gits. I'll be honest with you, but I'm exactly the same, and I think loads of users out there, when it gets out in the real world, are going to be exactly the same, and they're going to do the same things. So that's something you can actually factor into your design. And again, Triangular Pixels did a great talk just before this, a couple of hours ago, and they covered a lot of this stuff they're doing in their games. It's a really, really good idea to kind of bring everybody in the room in and involve people. There are obvious safety concerns. I'm saying you have to approach this carefully. Don't scare the bejesus out of every single user. But, you know, it's one thing for a game to tell a player to do that. Players, once they know that at that point in the game, they're going to be doing that anyway, making people jump out of the seats. But it's a very rich and fertile area to be kind of thinking of what you can do with that, what interesting things you can do in that space. So you see from this one is to think about this. Interface, any designer will tell you this is the root of all design choices. It all stems from the interface through the TV and the controller. What opportunities do these new interfaces offer? Because all of a sudden everything's changed. So there should be a whole slew of things out there that you can think of that nobody's thought of before in this space. I'm going to talk a little bit about UI, first of all. Anyone who knows Job Simulator will know the burrito reference, but I'll come to it in a minute. UI is kind of one of those things you see a lot of really creative, fantastic things with, but it always feels like a very, very rich area where there's going to be a lot of change coming up. It changes so quickly, what I've seen with UI. It's come on very, very fast. A lot of people say that UI is a barrier to natural intimacy with the VR worlds, and the more UI you can take away, the better, the more immersive it's going to be. Sometimes in games, obviously, we need to tell players information that wouldn't exist in the world diegetically in real life. So that then becomes a problem to solve. How do you get that UI in the world? But largely, there's a movement to kind of strip away the non-diegetic UI elements, or HUD overlays, as we probably think of them, because they're seen as another element that shouldn't and wouldn't exist if the world's to be believable. But UI can actually be a safety bubble, because if you think about having your UI around you, it's something that roots you to the fact that you're in a fictional world. It's something that doesn't exist in our world yet, although I'm sure when we get there, the guys who are designing holograms and things for the real world will just take all the learnings from what we've done in VR, because we're having to solve these problems now. But having your UI around you, say you have it at arm's length, is a useful thing, because it's like a comfort blanket for the user. If you have a bubble there that effectively becomes visible when it penetrates anything, and it stops anything coming inside that bubble, it acts like a kind of safety cage. It acts like, this is my personal space, those zombies aren't coming inside, I've got nothing to worry about. It's a really easy feature to implement as a kind of nice thing to let players choose as a comfort option if they find that, oh, actually, this zombie game's a bit too much for me. Now this is a way that they can kind of play it with a little bit less mortal fear that they're actually going to come into the personal space. Something to think about, though, if you take away the UI from VR, what you're taking away is one of those things that mark it as this virtual experience. What you're actually leaving behind is reality. And sometimes reality is one of those things that people don't necessarily want in VR. The abstraction layer that UI provides, if you're taking it away, you're taking away something that can keep the player grounded and comfortable in your experience. So it's a very strong anchor. It can be a very strong anchor. Go away. To the real world. I'm expecting the hotel thing to come up again in a minute. Don't underestimate how important it can be as a thing that some users will like to rely on as a thing to kind of keep them grounded and keep them feeling comfortable. Eventually they might want to turn it off, but going completely in-world UI, for some users you may find that you actually have to add in a layer of UI or some kind of floating hologram type thing as a comfort aid for players, so that's something to think about. So we're on to the burrito at last. So this is what I love. I love it when I stumble across things in VR that do really clever things, but they're so intuitive and natural that it's kind of like a bolt of lightning genius. So in Fantastic Contraption, if any of you have played, there's an entire UI embedded in this kind of inflatable robot cat that follows you around, and all your tools and everything you need, you pull out of this cat. And as crazy as it sounds, people get it straight away and it really works. In I Expect You to Die, all the menu options are in a briefcase that's open on the desk, and you can take all the things out of the documents and look at them, but that's how you actually interact with the menu. And in Job Simulator, the exit out of the game is to kind of eat a burrito that says exit on it, and you pick it up, you put it to your mouth and you chomp and you leave the game. And it's so stupid and ridiculous, but as soon as you see a burrito with the word exit on it, you get what you need to do with it. It just makes perfect natural sense, but it's really fun and really good. So these are very cool moments in VR, especially when the player figures it out for themselves, and it's kind of quite rewarding. So more like these, please, if you're making them. So you see from this is, you know, what magical, innovative UI opportunities does this now open up? A little bit about positional audio. Positional audio is one of those things, it's the potential is there for it to be super powerful, and it's such a core part of a VR experience. I mean, they always say that kind of the hotel calls when you least expect it. They always say that music is like 50% of any movie. Sound is 50% of any movie. And in VR, I think it's true. It's possibly more so. I tend to play Resident Evil 7 with the sound turned off because it's a lot less scary. It's not 50% less scary. It's about 90% less scary as soon as you turn the sound off, because the audio design on that is very, very strong. So if 50% of this medium is potentially locked away in the use of that positional 3D audio that we've got, then perhaps somebody could and should be exploring that more fully, because I've yet to see a real killer app for positional audio. I've yet to see someone come up with an absolutely killer game idea that uses it. I've seen lots of strong uses of it, but not one yet that you would say to somebody, I could show that to anybody and they would get why that's important straight away. It tends to be kind of a background thing. You'd notice if it was wrong, but when it's doing its job and it's all working right, it feels natural. So I'm interested in seeing somebody kind of showcase that. The next thing to think about is we get a lot of people pitching ideas now where they're effectively using the VR headset as a blindfold, as an isolation chamber. You've got your headphones on, you're blocking the player out, and then the players in the room are playing the game while that person's excluded. And that's really interesting, that's really novel, and I find that quite fascinating, that you would spend all this money and effectively play a game that you could just tie a blindfold on and you know, put some earplugs in and you get the same effect. But obviously they're playing a game on the TV and stuff like that, so it's all kind of interactive. People are doing some very clever space in that, clever things in that space. But I'm also especially interested in that idea of, we kind of say this to students when we do work with students sometimes, and I've yet to see a good answer to it, but could you make a blindness game in VR? Somebody said this to me once, and I've carried it with me ever since, because I think it's a really, really interesting question. I'm not talking Daredevil, I can see all the room in sonar. I'm talking actually blindfolding the user and kind of using sound cues, using positional audio and things like that. Could you find a ringing phone just by sound alone? You know, that would be interesting to me if somebody explored that. Another thing to think about in terms of positional audio is music games in VR, because to be honest with you, I love audio, I love music games, it's one of my big passions. I love the idea of Rock Band VR, I've not yet tried it. I love Audio Shield, I love anything music-wise in VR. Very, very powerful. But everything I've seen so far has just been taking existing music game ideas and sticking them in VR. And really, it's kind of, they're all based on things I've seen before. And I think this is as big an opportunity as kind of, when Fantasia came out in 1940, whenever it was, those kind of visuals of that opening piece, you see them now in performance art, you see them in visualizers on computers, you see them in the display on your hi-fi, it's all being influenced by that. And I kind of think there's a big opportunity here for somebody to make something in a world where you're actually inside the music and you can interact and affect the music. Somebody to make something as kind of landmark as that, I think there's definitely something there. So in terms of how we can elevate the user experience using binaural audio, think about what that killer app might be. Think about something that really, really depends on it, that really kind of hinges on how clever and how natural that is. And then the last one to talk about, I believe it's the last one if I'm paying attention, is social. It might not be, there might be a bonus one on the end, we'll find out. What I love about VR is this idea that it's the only social medium where you can actually high-five someone in another country. That's a great little thing to say to people, to get them to understand the communicative power of VR, because there isn't another way you could do that. And when you think about that, you think, wow, that's actually really, really powerful. This idea of shared presences we've heard so many times this week, and I'm going to say it again, super powerful, super fun. It's kind of as big a revelation as the first time you tried VR, the first time you try kind of shared presence with another human being. This is an internal social demo that we've shown a couple of times this year. What was fascinating to me in this is how, even with cartoony bodies, cartoony hands, and you know, very limited tracking points in terms of just the head and the hands, I was trolling the host in this, and he knew it was me straight away. He just went, "Jed, it's off." And he knew it was me without me even saying who it was or anything like that. So it's clear to me that a lot of that behaviour comes through straight away, even if you're not studying that person, even if you're not that familiar with that person. He knew it was me just because of what I was doing and the way I was moving. Couch play is a really core part of our DNA at PlayStation. Very, very important to us. This idea of everybody on the couch all being able to share and play together is a really important way that we're going to hope to spread the gospel of PlayStation VR and get other people to try it and maybe want to get one themselves. It's inherently a very, very strong social key. Titles that unlock this couch play dynamic, and again, we've heard about a couple this week that have been very, very interesting, and tap into that well. There's the potential for huge innovation and success there. Come back. So we always talk about kind of teamwork. We think, you know, we think about most of the makeup of multiplayer games. We always tend to think about them coming from real world activities, although we've seen in 2D games, there's a bunch of stuff that you do in multiplayer that you can't do Rocket League in real life, right? You couldn't do King of the Hill very easily in real life. So there are definitely game types out there that we haven't thought of yet. There are team functions and team opportunities there of things that we've not even thought of yet. And I think we need to think a little bit outside that box. The other thing to think about as well in terms of social is every time you give somebody a way for somebody else to see them in VR, whether that's seeing them externally in third person on the social screen, or you're in VR with them and you're having a shared presence experience, people start puppeteering their avatars. They can't help it, they love to do it. And I think there's something really, really key to that. I think performance and puppeteering are going to be a huge thing in VR. I think it's a really, really natural way for people to be able to express themselves. We've got all this sharing technology already, so you can instantly, now I can make a puppet show where I'm directly controlling the puppet. You know, and that's kind of like live motion capture for people. That's going to be huge, it's going to be very, very powerful. So, what new elements can you add to this already proven VR social dynamic? We know, we've heard so many times this week how powerful it is. What can we add to that? Just to run them through them very quickly then, and I think if we're lucky we might have a couple of minutes for questions. So don't forget about the voodoo magic, keep it in there. Make sure you think about presence and think about getting somebody who's in charge of presence wrangling, because it's going to be a very important part in the future. Think about that avatar relationship, the new opportunities that offers. Similarly, think about the liberation of controls that's happening with VR and what that can open up to you in terms of how users can interact with your world. Think about interesting uses for UI. Don't just try and push it out of the way and get rid of it, because it serves a function and sometimes we can't get around it. So you've got to be able to embrace it and do interesting things with it. Definitely think about the idea of social and how you can add social to your game. Even if it doesn't seem like it'll fit. Shared VR experiences, even where you're waiting for your turn on a go, if you're all in the lobby together, it's great fun. It really, really elevates it and adds to the kind of experience. It's really good. And finally, think about spatial audio and all the fun you can have putting mariachi bands on top of people's heads, and wherever they turn, they can't make them go away. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And if anybody's got any questions, we've got a couple of minutes, although we're probably running into coffee break time, so if you want to run for coffee, I will quite understand. Otherwise, I'm going to be about at the front for the next 15 minutes, so come and give me a shout if you want to. Any questions from anybody? No? Good. Come and shout at me if you want to. Oh, yeah.
Not really a question, more sort of a comment. I've seen lots of things on VR this week. My wife and I like games that are cooperative.
Yes.
So we've played Diablo for like 4 years.
Right.
You know, you play with a colleague. I used to play Age of Empires, and it was always better to play the two players against two computers instead of, you know, one-on-one.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why there aren't more cooperative things in VR that have been looked at. So I'd like to maybe explore a Skyrim type world and do a cooperative thing with that, or have maybe a video experience that would be, you know, go to a particular resort to see something, or share a sunset on this beach, or, you know, whatever they are, but shared experiences that are sort of cooperative, where you'd have maybe 2 PlayStations and 2 headsets, just so you could both escape to the same place, but share and be able to talk and experience that. Is there anybody doing that as far as you know? So,
yeah, there is. I mean, I've seen a lot of stuff moving into that area, and a lot of things where games are just letting people hang out in the worlds together for the first time, and that's interesting. I mean, it's great being in a game world, but having a kind of social lobby type environment within your game where people can just come and hang out and stuff like that works really, really well. I've certainly seen lots of movement into MMO type games and things like that. Kind of having a second co-op player as a standard option is becoming kind of, it's relatively popular on flat games, right, and console games and TV games and stuff like that. And yeah, I think probably we've got a little bit of catching up to do with that. But I guess part of that is, at the moment, we don't expect many households to have more than one VR headset. But certainly if there's other ways to interact, or if you're just doing it with somebody socially over the internet, over a network connection, yeah, I don't see any reason why you can't. If you can get one person in a world, how much harder is it to get a second person in? Especially if you're not giving them too much interactivity with each other and things like that. They're just both existing in the world. It can't be that much of an extra overhead. So yeah, I totally agree. I think it'd certainly make the user experience one of those things where it's easier to demonstrate it to someone else. It's easier to show a game off, bring them in the world with you, and you can both kind of experience it together. Yeah, it's a really good thought.
Thank you.
Any more for any more? Coffee time then, everybody. Go on, what are you waiting for? Thank you.